So despite there actually being a marginally decent selection of movies that came out in 2012, the unfortunate truth is that no lineup is ever perfect. There are movies that I was just aching with anticipation to see, and they just came up short of expectation. And some of them didn't even come up on the fucking radar. Anyway, here are the films that just completely crushed my spirit of anticipation this past year. Number 5. The Hobbit. First things first, I did not hate The Hobbit. In actuality, I'd say that I liked it a good deal, so why the hell is it on this list, you might say? Well, I guess it's partly my fault for overhyping it. I thoroughly enjoyed the Lord of the Rings films, and seeing that much of the team was going to be behind The Hobbit, as well as it being accompanied by some excellent trailers, this quickly became one of my most anticipated movies of 2012. I saw it the first chance I could, and despite the fact that I already said that I liked it, there was just something about the film that just left me unsatisfied. I'll try to explain it to the best of my ability. First, the good parts. It had the sweeping look and feel and epicness of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The performances from the main cast were great. It's always nice to see Andy Serkis as Gollum again. The special effects and action were fantastic. It had an amiable sense of adventure that I could really immerse myself in. All these things should make for a great movie, right? Well, yes, it should. So, how come I didn't get the same thrill from The Hobbit like I did with Lord of the Rings? Well, unfortunately, the film did have its share of glaring flaws. And that's the other main reason why I was a little let down by it. For one thing, Bilbo is essentially a secondary character in his own story. I mean, he's not useless, he's definitely utilized at times, but a lot of focus was placed on either Gandalf or Thorin and the dwarves. Now's probably a good time to mention that I haven't read the book, so maybe Bilbo's role will become more important in the films to follow, so I can't really hold that particular qualm against it. Also, I didn't really much care for the dwarves in the company, mainly because there wasn't really enough time for the audience unfamiliar with the source material to get to know them. They were essentially there to eat, drink, and fight, sometimes all at the same time. The person filling in the slot for the villain for the movie is just as bland to the core. And some comedic parts didn't work all that well. But my biggest problem with the film was its pacing. With it being almost 3 hours long, it certainly took its sweet-ass time moving along, given all the stuff that happens, or didn't happen for that matter. You'd think that by the end, Bilbo and his party would have gotten further along in their quest, and that's not even mentioning the famous eagle plot hole that makes a return for this film. I could tell they were trying to stretch this movie out. Not to say it was boring per se, it certainly kept my attention throughout, but I did feel that some parts were longer than they needed to be or could have been cut altogether. Seriously, did we really need the dwarves to break out into a Disney-style musical number cleaning up Bilbo's house? The Lord of the Rings possessed a more coherent sense of progress. Despite the movie being extremely long, it felt it was constantly moving forward with the story. I didn't feel it that much with The Hobbit. It was there, but to me, it felt a little too slow. Maybe that's just my fault, or maybe the idea of stretching a single 400-plus page book into three 3-hour movies wasn't really a bright one after all. You make the call, folks. Now, I feel that I have to clarify once again that I did like the film as a whole, but it's not something that I'd want to invest that much time into again in the foreseeable future. Oh well. Here's hoping the next two films are better. Number 4. Prometheus. Let's have a little fun, shall we? Let's try to get through this segment only asking questions. Starting now. Why did the engineer at the beginning strip down and commit ritual suicide at the waterfall? Why is it on the planet they have to wear oxygen helmets but are not required to wear gloves? Why are the so-called scientific experts so stupid? Why does David keep flip-flopping allegiances? Why would the engineers even bother to create humans in the first place if they were just going to destroy them later? Why didn't Charlize Theron just run to the left or right to avoid the humongous crashing donut spaceship instead of just running in a straight line? What the hell did David say to the engineer in his native tongue? Why did they have Guy Pearce play an 80-year-old man when they could have just as easily gotten a more age-appropriate actor to play the character? Why did the film think that zombies with super strength in a sci-fi movie was a good or original idea? Why is it that the best performance in the movie required no emotional input whatsoever? Did the writers not even bother to read a book on astrophysics or space distance? How come I can't remember anything else significant about this certified fresh movie? Okay, I'm finished ripping off Red Letter Media now. I know I wasn't the only one disappointed with Prometheus, and people have gone into more detailed explanations than I have, so I won't spend much more time here. The hype surrounding this movie was fairly massive, even for an R-rated movie. Even I was pumped for it. But when I finally saw it, I was more confused than anything. A lot of people were, actually. The special effects were absolutely gorgeous to look at, but the story was just too convoluted and had its head up its own ass to be enjoyable in any means. Not to mention the parts where it actually hints of it being an Alien prequel just felt tacked on and didn't really fit with the rest of the film. In a nutshell, Prometheus had a very cool concept, but a really piss poor execution. Moving on. Number 3. Killing Them Softly. Man, was this movie a letdown. I actually got a little too ahead of myself and had a spot reserved for my favorite films of 2012 list because I thought it was going to kick so much ass. The trailer looked awesome. You had a darkly humorous crime story that took cues from Goodfellas and The Departed. It sounded like it was going to have some great and interesting dialogue. And to top it all off, you had Brad Pitt playing a fucking hitman. Consider me sold. Academy Awards, here we come! Then I actually saw the movie. It's not in my favorites list anymore. Fucking premature celebration. I knew going into it that Killing Them Softly was going to be a somewhat dialogue-heavy film, and that the general audience would probably not like it because of it. That's fine with me. I love a movie with interesting conversations. Yeah, Killing Them Softly has barely any of that. At first, when they were trying to establish the characters in the story, it showed promise. But as soon as the actual conflict was underway, holy shit. The obscure things the characters talked about wasn't interesting at all, and a good deal of it was completely irrelevant to the story. Or it could have been, I don't really know, nor do I care. It tries so hard to mimic Tarantino that it just completely backfires, and for most of the film, I was just bored by it. I didn't care at all for any of the characters here. In fact, some of them are just downright horrible. I wanted them to die. But with the exception of Brad Pitt, of course, and even then, he doesn't really get to do anything until about 40 minutes in. The only other person you might even have the slightest bit of empathy towards is Ray Liotta's character, who is essentially filling the role of the human punching bag / bullet sponge. He goes through so much shit you just can't help but feel sorry for the poor guy. Everyone else is just either bland, forgettable, or just terrible people in general. Most notably is James Gandolfini's character, whose presence could have been completely cut from the movie and nothing would have been lost. All he ever does throughout his entire appearance is drink and talk about the different sorts of poontang he's scored with throughout the years. He doesn't even do what he was there to do in the first place. Completely pointless character. Such talent wasted. The worst part is that there are brief moments in Killing Them Softly that actually show signs of what it could have been. A brilliant slow motion sequence. The part where they beat the crap out of Ray Liotta for the first time is absolutely brutal to watch, which exemplified the effects of real life violence rather than the typical Hollywood violence we're all accustomed to seeing. A tense stalking sequence near the end where Brad Pitt finally gets to do something. These were all great scenes, but you have to sift through all the fluff and pointless filler to get to it. It's like finding a diamond on the small island, but in order to reach it, you have to swim through dirty, festering, shit-infested slop formerly known as water. It's just not worth it. Not even the most badass closing line in recent memory can save Killing Them Softly from just being a bland, mostly unengaging crime drama living in the shadow of far superior films that it took influence from pushing its own cynical agenda. And before you ask, yes, I did get the soulless anti-corporate subtext. That doesn't make the movie any less dull. Number 2. This is 40. Judd Apatow, what happened? I like a lot of the movies you produce. I've liked the movies you directed so far. Yes, even Funny People. I considered you a very reliable comedic artist. So how did This is 40 manage to be, well, not funny? I don't get it. The trailer didn't give off that impression. I know it was going to be perhaps a little more grounded in reality than your previous movies, maybe even go for a more dramatic tone in dealing with going over the hill and compensating with the reality of it, but still maintaining your style of humor a little bit. It looked good. The parts that were shown were pretty funny. I was really excited to have a good laugh and maybe gain a little insight on what it feels like to cross into the threshold of middle age. I'll say it again, Judd. What happened? This is 40 just falls flat on its ass big time. It's not at all that engaging. The jokes have no life or charisma put into it. And the ones we were expecting to be raunchy is either over way too soon, or just explained through dialogue that have about as much passion put into it as a drunk sloth. The dramatic aspect is just as bad, with situations that aren't interesting or had the potential to be interesting but was squandered big time in favor of streamlined bullshit that may hook the general unversed audience, but not someone like me. And some of the conflict is either half-assedly resolved at the last minute or not even resolved at all. The acting is probably the biggest slap in the face. I like Paul Rudd. I like Albert Brooks. I like Griffin Dowd and Jason Segel. What could have been, should have been comedic gold is so just wasted. Leslie Mann is extremely annoying and I hated her almost right from the beginning. And Megan Fox is, well, seriously guys, what the fuck do you expect acting-wise from Megan Fox? Really? Oh, and Judd, please stop putting your daughters in your films. I hate to be the one to tell you this, but they cannot act. Every time I see them and hear them, I just couldn't help but cringe. It was so bad. So maybe next time, let up on the nepotism, please? This movie was just boring. Almost all of the jokes were lame, so once you take that, the comedy aspect out of it, what do you have left? An upper-class white family having a little trouble with their midlife crisis and their financial issues. Viewers, does that sound interesting or funny to you? It does to me. Now I'll give you some time to ready your torches and sharpen your pitchforks for the vitriolic reaction that some of you will have for number 1, to bring up some dishonorable mentions for other disappointing films this year. John Carter. I actually wasn't very excited for John Carter on the whole, but I held it in the back of my head, seeing that it may have had a tiny shred of potential. To me, it just didn't look that appealing, and from the second I saw the trailer, I knew it was going to fail at the box office. The only reason I saw it was because an acquaintance of mine gave it a glowing recommendation, so I put aside a little hope for it, but my fears became reality and I ended up spending 2.5 hours I'll never get back. I'm aware that the source material served as the progenitor for most other action-adventure titles made since then, so though I wasn't particularly engaged by the story, I can't really hold it against it. My biggest problem is that, like I said before, it had potential, but it wasn't executed very well. I didn't like how the film looked at all. I know Mars is supposed to be a barren and desolate wasteland, but this is a sci-fi fantasy flick. Get some varying color in there or something. To call John Carter monochromatic would be an understatement. There's more brown and orange in this movie than a fully occupied latrine at the Jersey Shore. The acting was extremely hammy, especially coming from Taylor Kitsch, whom I'm confident will never star in a big-budget blockbuster or maybe any movie ever again. I know John Carter was supposed to be the original action hero, but that doesn't excuse stale acting. The action scenes were hit or miss. One was admittedly kind of badass, and the other was just straight up anticlimactic. It was over before it even fucking began. And even on a budget of $250 million butt-fucking-dollars, some of the special effects still look cheap. Bottom line, John Carter blew the chance I gave it. But I wasn't really expecting much from it anyway, so yeah, skip this one. Brave. I actually thought Brave wasn't bad. But seeing how it's a Pixar movie, it fell short of the incredibly high bar the studio had set itself. It's also a completely misleading movie, as most of you have probably already heard. At first I was expecting a dark, epic, quest-driven story by a strong female protagonist. That would have been fucking awesome! But as more info came out, it was starting to look more like your typical Disney princess fairy tale. And that eventually became the film's primary weakness. Everything else about it I love. The animation, the art style, the music, and there were some decent amounts of comedy thrown into it as well. But the overall story just wasn't unique. It had the potential to be, even with the story we were ultimately given, but it squandered that opportunity for a more streamlined approach. It wasn't terrible, but with Pixar's reputation for unprecedented storytelling, Brave definitely played it safe. It's a significant improvement over Cars 2, but Brave just doesn't feel like a Pixar movie. And seeing their upcoming schedule of planned releases, I fear the much-beloved studio may have hit a plateau in terms of quality. I certainly hope I'm wrong, but I'll be looking at Pixar more cautiously now. Lawless. I didn't know much about Lawless going into it, other than it played at Cannes Film Festival, but I like historical movies based on true stories, and it was set during the Prohibition era, which was an interesting period. So it sparked my curiosity, and it was... meh. I liked the setting, the cinematography was nice, and the overall story itself was pretty good. There were some genuinely affecting scenes, which mostly consist of violence, throughout. But there were a few things that really weighed it down. First, the movie is about 3 moonshiners who were brothers, but it really only concentrates on just 2 of them. And for some reason that didn't sit well with me. Gary Oldman is billed as one of the marquee characters, when in actuality it's only an extended cameo. I think he only has about 5 minutes worth of screen time throughout the entire film. That irked me a bit too. My biggest qualm really was with the acting. I've heard people say that it was one of the film's shining points, but I didn't like the acting at all. Tom Hardy definitely needs a dialect coach because his American accent was just awful. I didn't like him in this movie at all. And Shia LaBeouf? Well, I'll give him credit that he's actually at least trying this time, but he didn't sell me with his performance. To me, it was just Shia LaBeouf being Shia LaBeouf with a southern accent. But the worst offender, bar none, is Guy Pearce, who gives quite possibly the most ham-fisted, over-the-top villain performances I've ever seen. There's no subtlety here. It's as though in order to prepare for the role, he watched a bunch of cartoon serials from the 1930s and studied the villains there. The moment he appears on screen for the first time, he's almost screaming, look at me, don't I just look ravishing looking like a prim, proper, snide little prick? Tone it down, man! Show some restraint for Christ's sake! Overall, I wouldn't say Lawless was terrible, but I wouldn't recommend it either. There is a silver lining to it, though. Jessica Chastain has a nude scene in this movie, and she is lovely. So, if you're curious about it, just go rent it and make your own judgments. The movie, I mean. And naked Jessica Chastain.